everyone. Welcome back to Microeconomics. So today we are going to follow with what we discussed last time about the elasticity of demand and other elasticity concepts, and trying to bring this concept or trying to bring this topic to the public policy. Especially today we're going to talk about the tax policy. So in general, there are two types of tax that we usually pay in our life. One is the income tax, and the other one is the sales tax. So today we are mainly focused on the tax on spending, which is the sales tax, and trying to understand how elasticity of demand will play important roles in the markets when the government designing the tax policy. Again, well, in this chapter, we are going to mainly focus on studying the incidence of tax and the shift of the tax burdens with the policy. So, we can actually use a very simple example to demonstrate any change of the tax policy will affect the markets. So suppose we have a government who are trying to impose a tax on seller of soda. The sellers are taxed $0.5, which is 50 cents for every soda they sell in the market. So we are basically trying to ask the question, which side of the market will be paying for that extra 50 cents that just posted by the government? Well, to answer that question, we have to start with how this tax policy will affect the market in general. So when the government is trying to pay a tax into the market, regardless the tax is going to be placed on the seller or the buyers. Well, generally speaking, we can think about this like a additional burden or additional cost to produce soda in the market. And therefore, we're going to expect to see the market will move from the original equilibriums to a new equilibrium, where you will see the supply curve shift up by exactly 50 cents. This is basically the way how we can conceptualize the tax amount. It's adding additional to the cost of soda in our markets. So at every quantity that the firms sell in the market, now they have to pay additional 50 cents to produce soda and sell it in the market. However, even though the tax is placed on the seller in the market, but is the seller going to basically say, I'm going to pay the full 50 cents amount in the market? Of course, the answer is no. Well, then we would like to answer the questions. How much are they bearing the tax? If they're not bearing the total of 50 cents full amount, how much the buyers in the markets are bearing the rest of the 50 cents? Well, we can actually look at this graph and try to think about the difference between the original equilibrium, which is pointing at $1.25, and the new equilibrium after the shift of the supply curve, which pointing at $1.50. So the easy way to think about this is, before any tax policy implemented in this market, buyers are usually paying just $1.25. And after the shift of the supply curve, because of this additional cost to produce soda, now the buyers in the market has to pay a new equilibrium price, which is $1.50. So as a buyer, you can very easily see how much you are paying additionals in the markets with this tax policy. Well, as a buyer, we are paying 25 cents out of the 50 cents. Well, then how much the sellers are covering of this 50 cents of tax? Obviously, it's the rest. So the seller will have to cover 25 cents of the tax, and the buyer will cover 25 cents of the tax. And at the end, this 50 cents of tax amount will not be covered by just one side of the market. So they will be shared, in this case, equally in the market. So we talk about how the tax policy will affect the supply curve in the market. So in our textbook, we are going to see a lot of different examples, so you can actually try to understand how the tax policy will affect this, the supply and demand in the markets, so that you can actually make a more um, reasonable estimations of the change in equilibrium and also the tax bear by the consumers and sellers in the markets. So now we are going to talk about how the tax policy will be determined by the price elasticity of demand in the markets. So remember, in the previous example, we have the buyer and seller covering half of the tax amount. But is that going to be always the case? Of course. Well, that is just one hypothetical example, and it's not always the case that the buyer and the seller will equally sharing the tax amounts. Well then, what decides and how it's determined which side of the market will pay more of the tax burdens? Well, we're going to use this example here. Suppose the government trying to impose a tax on gasoline, and you live very, very far from the city, and you know that you need to commute with your car every day. In another word, you have a very extremely inelastic demand for gasoline in this market. So we are trying to build a model and trying to investigate, well, which side of the market will be responds more for the imposed tax by the government. So here we are going to use this model to describe that hypothetical conditions. We have a very inelastic demand for gasoline and a regular supply curve for gasoline. So we would like to know by the end of this example, we want to actually find out which side of the market actually paying more depends on the nature of elasticity of demand. So first, we look at the market equilibrium. And in this case, we have the market equilibrium pointing at $1.25 and 5 units in the market. And let's suppose the government is placing a $1 tax on the gasoline per gallons in the market. And again, that shifts the supply curve up by exactly $1 amount. And here we have a new supply curve. Once we form the supply curve, we can actually start looking at the new market equilibrium. And in this case, we actually have the new market equilibrium pointing at $2. And the quantity will drop to 4 units. So here we can actually start evaluating. So in this case, the supplier is paying additional 25 cents on top of what they supposed to pay it out, right? So the $1 amount, it's not completely covered by the supplier, but only 25 cents out of the dollar is covered by the supplier. And in this case, the consumer is paying 75 cents additional more as comparing to the original equilibrium price. So remember, consumer in this market, they used to pay $1.25, but after the shift of the supply curve because of the policy, now they have to pay the new equilibrium price, which is $2, and that's a 75 cents more than what they supposed to pay. So intuitively, what happened in this market? Well, because the consumer is the consumer in this market is much more inelastic comparing to the supply side, and therefore, whenever there is a tax imposed to the markets, consumer they are more willing to accept the higher price, because even price goes up by a lot, they are not going to cut back on using the gasoline. However, on the supply side, because they are much more flexible comparing to the demand side, and therefore they are able to shift some of these costs to the consumer side in the market, and therefore they can pay or bear less of the tax burden. So If you think about this example, whenever we have a more inelastic demand in the market, well, usually the tax that imposed to the product will be more bearing by the consumers. However, if we are buying a product that is relatively more elastic than the supply, and that makes it a little bit easier for the firm to bear the cost of the tax burden than the consumers. So the rule of thumb, so the placement of the tax can be different from the payment of the tax. So the placement is who the government decide to collect the tax from in the market. So the tax can be placed on the consumers, or sometimes the tax can be placed on the suppliers. However, it's different to what we discover in this chapter, who actually pay the tax amounts. The government will determine the placement of the tax. However, the supply and demand in the markets determines who pays the tax in the markets. If the demand is relatively inelastic comparing to the supply, then buyers usually will bear more of the tax burden. If the demand is relatively more elastic than the supply side, then the seller will have to bear more of the tax burdens in the market. And vice versa. If the supply is relatively more elastic, then the buyer will have to bear more tax burden. And if the supply is relatively more inelastic comparing to the demand, then the seller will have to bear more tax burdens. Well, those rule of thumb help us to get a general sense of how the tax burden is being shared in the market. Now we have one more topic to talk about this tax policy. Remember, in the price control policy chapter, we talk about how the price control sometimes can hurt the markets by creating the deadweight loss. Well, do we have the same issue here with the tax policy? If it yes, well, how are we going to identify it? So keep in mind, any deadweight loss that we study in economics, it's usually generated by using the idea of reduce of total possible transactions in the market. So we would like to actually investigate how the tax policy might affect the total transactions in the market so that we can capture the total deadweight loss in the market with the policy. So we're using this example here to demonstrate. Let's suppose we have a market that's currently operating at the full efficiency or the maximum efficiency at the equilibrium where the supply and demand meeting. So we have the yellow triangle represent the consumer surplus and the orange triangle represent the producer surplus. However, if there is a tax policy that actually putting an additional cost to the product in the markets and causing the supply curve to shift up, now the new equilibrium quantity in the market will reduce from 4 units to 3 units. And as a result, we will have the consumer surplus to shrink to this yellow triangle and the producer surplus shrink to this orange triangle. Well, there is a middle part of this market where we still have to define. But first, we would like to look at the deadweight loss. So the red triangle in this market, it's basically representing the deadweight loss from the tax policy. Remember, we're supposed to have the potential transactions of 4 units in this market, but now, because of the tax policy, it reduced to 3 units only. Both the consumer and the producers actually has this potential gain from trading, but they are prevented to gain from this trades because of the tax policy. Well, in the middle sections, we have the blue rectangle. Well, this is the part where we don't see in the price control policy, because in the price control policy, well, both the consumers and the producers still capturing all the benefits in the market. However, in the tax policy, well, because we know the government are basically here to collect all the tax revenue. And therefore, this blue rectangle is representing the total tax revenue collected by the government from the market. So to sum up, if we're looking at this graph, we know at least the consumers are collecting some of the benefits, the producers are collecting some of the benefits, and the government can actually collect the tax revenue to spend on different social welfare programs. So the total welfare to the society still adds up to be the trapezoid area of the three colors, yellow, orange, and blue. However, comparing to the full equilibrium efficiency, we know we still have that little red triangle that we have lose it in this from this policy, and that's the debt weight loss that we are trying to study in this model. Well, we also want to actually think about how the tax policy actually being most effective. Well, especially we want to actually understand how different demand might affect the tax revenue collected by the government. So the elasticity of demand also demonstrates how much revenue the government can collect from the market. We are taking a two extreme case here. So in this example, we start with an equilibrium point for product A and product B. So the red line is a regular demand curve for product A, and the green line is the perfectly inelastic demand for product B. And we have the supply curve, which basically just like a general supply curve. Here, what we're trying to do is to basically think about if there is a tax policy actually forcing the supply curve to move up by $1, then we can actually take a look at the new equilibrium for product A, where the new supply curve meeting the red lines. So in this case, well, we have the product A selling in the market, which is 3 units at a price of $3. And for the new equilibrium of product B, after the shift of the supply curve, we have the new supply curve meeting the product D, the green lines, and we have the total units sold still at 3.5 units, and the total price per unit is $3.50. So if we are going to collect or calculate the tax revenue connected from each product, product A, every unit will be collect $1 by the government, which is going to generate $3 of tax revenue. In product B case, we have an extremely inelastic demand, and we still have 3.5 units times $1, which is the tax set in the market. And the government at the end will collect $3.50. So therefore, if we compare the extreme case of product B, the extremely inelastic demand, to a regular elastic demand, governments will aim to try to maximize the total tax revenues from the markets. They should always collect it from the inelastic demand products. And that is the way how they can actually generate the most funding from the markets. And that's also a very interesting topic to discover in your later study of economics. For instance, we know cigarette smoking is a very inelastic product. People who purchase cigarettes, they do not care about the price that much because they are addicted to that behaviors. As a result, when the government impose a tax policy on cigarettes, a very heavy tax, and trying to collect funding to generate funding for educational programs or maybe for healthcare program, they are able to collect a huge amount of funding from the cigarette markets because, well, cigarettes is a very extremely inelastic demand product as comparing to others. Well, you can try to think about this example and relate to most of the products in your life. So we have covered the whole chapter 5 with many topics, and I hope that you can take your time to understand and trying to apply these topics in your life. Well, after this price elasticity, demands and supplies and other elasticity concepts that we learned, well, in the next chapter, we are going to start looking at the firm behaviors and studying the firm's operations. Well, I'm looking forward to see you in the next class. I hope you enjoyed the lecture today. Goodbye.